Welcome to Discussions of Music, Healing, and Consciousness with your hosts Chris Noble and Bill Paratzman. Chris is about to embark on an epic journey. He has plans to visit the ancient musical spaces in Central and possibly South America. So in this episode, we take a look at some of the ways music has informed civilization for many thousands of years. We get curious about how our ancient ways of using music might be re-employed today, and offer you some ideas about how to investigate this potential for yourself. We'll be talking about all that and much, much more, as always in these open conversations, here on Discussions of Music, Healing, and Consciousness.
I'm watching this amazing show on Netflix called Ancient Apocalypse hosted by Graham Hancock. And anyone who's into alternative history or has watched his episode on the Joe Rogan show will be familiar with Graham Hancock's basically his way of looking at the past was that 12,000 years ago was the end of the last ice age, and what happened was it may have completely all the cataclysms that hit this planet could have absolutely destroyed a very advanced civilization from deep antiquity, tens of thousands of years ago, and we're just
boom,
picking
gone,
up the
right?
pieces. Yeah, and he always says we're a species with amnesia, and we forget that where we think civilization started in Mesopotamia was a restarting. It wasn't the start, it was a restart of civilization. And we've had many cycles of civilization throughout who knows how long. And it's so cool to see this finally on Netflix in like a mainstream format. It's really well done. It's a great documentary. And I'm just so giddy watching it because I've been following his stuff and other people's research like this for years, just waiting for the mainstream to kind of get into it. And now it's finally starting to happen, seeing it on Netflix. And one of the episodes takes place in Mexico. And I will be down there in December throughout this winter, probably maybe down to South America. And I'm so excited to go explore some of these ancient sites. And as I look at some of these sites, all the thing that keeps coming back to me is a lot of these buildings from the ancient world are these amazing acoustic chambers. And they were on a level of knowledge with sound and perhaps, of course, music and acoustics and how they all work together. And I want to go down, when I go down there, one of the many things I want to do is experiment with playing music, playing different instruments, chanting, using my voice in these different ancient chambers, temples, etc., and just see what effects happen, see what happens to myself and others, and what it sounds like in these spaces. And that leads me as I've researched this a lot already in my life, it always leads me to ask the question, how did the ancients use sound and music in their culture? And I feel like we're only scratching the surface, because I would say mostly when we look back through history, we think of it as a very ceremonial thing. And of course it is, right? It definitely is that. But is it more than that? Because we always think, oh, it's just for, a ritual and a ceremony. It's always just, that's it. I'm like, or could it have been used for other things like, oh, I don't know, healing, using frequency to heal and cure people of various ailments? Or was it used to move things? Acoustic levitation, we know that exists now. Were they using it to move these megalithic blocks and bricks and stones that they somehow would form into these beautiful structures? Were they using it for that? Were they using it to create advanced technology that we can't even imagine, like stargates or portals? Or why were they aligning these sites to all these like summer solstices, winter solstice, and the spring and fall equinoxes? Well, or different star constellations. Maybe it's because when you align these things on the planet Earth and you build a site in specific geometry at the specific place on Earth, orienting it to these particular specific areas, maybe that's how you create natural portals or stargates. And the ancients do talk about this kind of stuff. So backtracking to our topic here, because I'm going a little off here.
No. But before you do, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Because if there was like the 12,000 year mark is where such civilizations got wiped out, are they able to tell like how many years before that moment those civilizations might have existed? Like, were they 10,000 years old or 20,000 years old? Do we know?
Yeah, there's some really interesting dating techniques that are not the traditional ones. There's a branch of astronomy and archaeology called archaeoastronomy, And what they do is they recognize, and this is going on an assumption, so maybe it's not right, but they have found really interesting things. They go on the assumption that the ancients were obsessed and very meticulous about alignments to the stars.
Yeah.
And they definitely, and the most conservative academics all agree, they absolutely align these sites to the stars, and they align them perfectly, FYI,
Yeah.
to these constellations. Usually Sirius, which is the brightest star in the sky, or again, spring, fall equinoxes, whatever. And some of these sites, when you go to them, when you go on Google Map and you take a look at them from above and you orient them and align them to these constellations, sometimes they're quite off. And so what archaeoastronomy does is they go, okay, well, what if they actually were aligned perfectly with this star alignment? And the reason that they're off is because the wobble of the Earth, the precession, it's called precession, the
Yep.
wobble of the Earth makes it so that over time, thousands of years, those stars won't be where they were at that time anymore.
Got
And
it.
so what we do is we assume that, like, oh, they just made a mistake or they just did it for whatever reason, which maybe is true, or is that it's actually so much older that it was, when it was built, it was aligned to that constellation or that alignment. And so with archaeoastronomy, you can use mathematics and astronomy in the records that we have,
Yeah,
and you
kind
can
of
go
back it
back in
up, right?
time. You back it up, and then you back it up to when these sites were in alignment, and sometimes dates like 15,000, 20,000, 30,000, 35,000 years old start to come up, and you really start to scratch your head then and go, okay, maybe we're dealing with some again cycles of civilization. How old were these? We don't know, but
Yeah.
there's some pretty cool methods out there.
That's the answer I was looking for, because I've often thought that here we are in our little, how old do we want to say civilization as we know it is?
Yeah, about
Let's give
six,
it
7,000
six.
years.
Let's be generous. We'll give it 10,
Sure.
right? 10,000. But even that is like a drop in the bucket. So if this is as far as we've come in 10,000 years, and there are other potential places where they date back to, I don't know, 20, 30,000 years. So there's at least a 10,000 year chunk of change where these ancient civilizations were able to go from zero to wherever they got to, right?
Yep.
Before,
Definitely.
some cataclysmic event wiped everything out. So, okay, if we're in our 6,000th year of a 10,000 year cycle of, learning stuff and getting better, I don't feel so bad.
No,
you know,
we're doing all right.
we're doing okay. I mean, we've come a long way theoretically. In many ways, we've come further than some of the ancients did, but we also don't know how to like move giant precision cut, multiple ton blocks to build stuff with, the way that the
Yeah.
ancients had to.
Or we don't understand our planet because they worked with the planet. They used the energy of the planet. They found what Nikola Tesla found, which was free energy that you can get from the Earth itself and the cosmos, and work with them and the ionosphere of the planet and everything like that. And so they also knew how to work with the, now they weren't perfect people. It seems like you look into myths like Atlantis, and one of the potential reasons why Atlantis didn't, went to smithereens was because of hubris and ego, and kind of like us today. And
Global
it's a
warming
really good
kept
reminder.
drowned it.
Yeah, our nuclear war. I mean, the Bhagavad
Yeah.
Gita and the ancient Veda texts of ancient India talk about a nuclear war, and then Oppenheimer, who invented the nuke, literally quotes the Bhagavad Gita, and he says, "I'm the second, but then I am the creator of the atomic bomb in the modern world." And he recognized, and a lot of these the military, and they seem to be very interested in ancient history in a way that I feel like almost historians aren't, because they're looking at it a bit more than myth. They're like, well,
Yes.
what if we had some ancient tech that we could capitalize on, and unbeknownst to anyone else, that gives them an advantage. So, and then bringing it back to music and sound for a bit, it's like, you look at all these tribes and these cultures around the world, and one of the main stories that they all have in common is an ancient flood. There's always this ancient flood myth. And one of the ways in which this myth is preserved is through song, right? Think about all these tribes, and how do oh, they're doing all these rituals and all these things. And I think a lot of Westerners, and I say this because I used to think this when I was younger, and I'm like, this is just kind of like, looks like silly superstition, to be honest. That was my ignorant perspective back in the day. And now I realize a lot of the stuff, far beyond just the spiritual aspects, which are all, there's a lot of reasons for why they use song. And I'd say one of them is to preserve story. And what more important story would there be than the literal like apocalypse to the human race,
Yeah.
essentially? And
Yeah.
did we all die? No, we're here today. So obviously some of us survived, but it must have decimated 80 to 90% of our population. That's a huge, huge trauma. And we carry that trauma in our epigenetic memories, in our DNA. Don't forget, like, we have many, 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 many generations, 45 to 50 generations of memory in our epigenetic DNA that we know of. Maybe it even goes back further. So there's a trauma throughout all of us from some sort of ancient, cataclysm, right? So they're preserved through song. Song's a great way to keep story alive, right?
Absolutely, sure, because it embeds it in memory. Like when you sing it, it's there. It's just in you.
Well, and think about with Alzheimer's or dementia, when you
Mhm.
play music from their childhood, they can't remember what they had for breakfast, but all of a sudden they can recite every word of the song. Like, what a great way to keep that in your memory.
Yeah. I mean, we're scratching the surface on this music thing. As advanced as we
Right.
already are, right? We're scratching the surface. And for my money, it goes way beyond science. I mean, science is going to be able to explain this stuff. But when you get down to it, what's the scientific explanation for why we have all these flood myths that aren't actually myths, maybe?
Yeah.
Right? What's the science behind that? Are we being, I mean, I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, right? Is global warming not a new thing? Is it a cyclical thing?
It,
Right? I mean,
it,
we
it
did have an ice
is.
age not too long ago, right?
It is cyclical. For
That's
sure it is.
what the world does. It has ice ages, and then it equalizes the temperature, and then things get warmer for a while, and then it's just
Yeah.
like this. It's like the Earth is breathing, you know?
It's like it's alive or something. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought of
It's a
that,
living
right?
organism. It's so bizarre. Living organism, and it has, like, it is constantly changing. I think that's the thing that we do. Like, I'm not to say global warming is not happening and climate change isn't happening. It definitely is. I would just say it's more natural because it is happening, because it is changing,
Yeah.
and we're also helping accelerate it. It's both. It's both
Yep.
things. And definitely we got to respect Mother Earth. But if she didn't want us on the planet, we wouldn't be here.
We wouldn't be here.
Let's just put it that way. We would not.
And
We would be gone.
it's a
She's
self-regulating
way more
system too.
powerful.
Hey, if
Yeah, it
89% of us
is.
are going to go poof in whatever the next natural disaster is. It's good that we know that, right?
Yep. And we're
Because
still here. We can survive. We're pretty good. And you look at, the funny thing is, like, well, where's all the ancient knowledge? And you're like, well, think about this. Like, the most sophisticated, typically on the technological side of things, sometimes are the first to suffer when a huge cataclysm happens and the quote unquote grid goes down and all the
yep.
civilization goes down. Who remaining are the best to get through that? It's the hunter gatherers.
Oh
The
yeah, the
hunter
first
gatherers,
peoples. Yep.
the first peoples, all of a sudden they become the ones that survive. And that's what happened. That's what Graham Hancock and a lot of other people think, is that there's a huge civilization, let's call it Atlantis, maybe Lemuria, whatever, and then this great cataclysm happened, decimated it. It also rose sea levels by 400 feet. So it put most places just completely underwater. That's why a lot of the really hot architecture, or hot archaeology, like places to look that are awesome, are all underwater, because those are all coastal cities. But
Hmm.
yeah, it puts them all underwater. And then, who's left over to survive? Well, the people that are civilized don't, like you and me, most of us out there, the grid goes down. I mean, we're pretty screwed. Not to be all doom and
Yeah.
gloom, it's just more fact of the matter.
Yeah.
We don't really know how to survive. But the hunter gatherers in the Amazon or parts of Africa, in Australia, those people, would they even know? They
Right.
might not even know
Exactly.
something's changed. Their life doesn't change at all. They're good. They're fine. And so
So
what would
great.
happen is there's go
No, go
ahead.
ahead.
I was
You
just going to
first.
say, there would just be a bunch of hunter gatherers, and then a couple of fragments of our civilization people would be left over, and maybe they would go to these hunter gatherer places and teach them different things like agriculture, architecture, mathematics, astronomy. And oh wait, you look at all these myths, the myth of Osiris, or the myth of Quetzalcoatl down in Mexico, the myth of all these other cultures. They always talk about someone coming by boat, coming to the land, and then teaching them civilization. And it's, again, all the same. Different
Yeah.
names, different details. Story is always the same. So maybe that is what happened. And it's weird because you look at Mesopotamia and all of a sudden it's like hunter gatherer, boom, agriculture, mathematics, geometry,
Yeah.
everything, astronomy, all of this stuff, all overnight happened. So you got to wonder, was it taught by the survivors? Probably,
The wisdom
probably
keepers.
the wisdom keepers, right? And again, taught in what ways? Well, probably one of them would be through song. That's a great way to preserve that information, especially for hunter-gatherer tribes and whatnot that would be using song and music already,
And of course, we like to say that music is the universal language, but there might be a time where it's like the only way to communicate.
right?
I've
Perhaps that and telepathy. I don't know.
well, so we started out how to talk about like the cultural significance of First Peoples in Canada and how that's working. And look at where the conversation has gone. We didn't even get to that place. But
Sorry, Bill.
no, no, no. It's totally cool because here's the thing. We're in Africa right now. I think I've told this story before, but I have a preacher friend who wanted me to be part of his praise band, play keyboard. And so what kind of music do you want to do? He said, West Indian music. So that's, for people who don't know, it's like the music of the Caribbean, basically. And if you look up West Indian music on Wikipedia, you're going to get like, I don't know, hundreds of genres of music within that giant blanket, right? So does that mean pick one, right? What does it mean?
Right.
Well, um, so I started to make some suggestions. He said, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't do that. I'm like, well, wait a minute. The origin of all this music is in where? West Africa, with like all of the beats in modern music come from West Africa. They come from the voodoo tradition. I'll call it a tradition to be kind. Like rock and roll beats, jazz, the whole thing. I mean, the migration of that musical tradition to North America through the Caribbean it's kind of obvious. It's like that's what exists. So I mentioned this to my pastor friend. He's like, "Oh my gosh, we can't do that. That's voodoo music." And I'm like, "Well, what music isn't?"
Right.
I mean, how insulated were the dead white guys up in Western Europe, starting pre-Bach? And clearly we've got incredible appearances of that in the modern world with all the various subgenres of metal, rap, you name it. I mean, it's incredible. But this all connects to the First Peoples conversation, because I suspect that if we were able to do a better job of singing each other's songs, there we go, I'll say it, we wouldn't have the cultural angst that we do these days that appears in crazy, just non-self-sustaining appearances of like anti-Semitism and racism and all these other isms. It's like, come on. Has anybody here ever learned and played or maybe heard or danced to some klezmer music? That'll change your whole idea about what it means to be Jewish. Klezmer is some of the most joyous, incredible, complicated stuff I've ever heard in my life, And what about the West African? Every town has a storyteller whose job it is to remember the stories of all the people in the village. They have to be able to sing them on demand, right? Sing them. The stories of everyone in the village are sung by this one individual whose responsibility it is to keep those stories alive. I mean, how different would it be if we learned to sing each other's music? And in the very long way of arriving at this simple question, and to bring it back to First Peoples, it's like I'm wondering in Canada, which has done such a great job with reconnecting with First Peoples, like unlike America, has there been any effort to sort of learn the songs of their primary cultures?
Yeah, like Canada, we look good on paper for this kind of stuff.
Well, that's where it counts, right? It's a political correctness thing, but I'm going beyond that.
Sure, 100%. And yeah, we're doing great there. But when it comes to the actual rollout, I'm not certainly like qualified necessarily to really get into the detail of all of this, but I would say, like we do some of the surface layer things, but there's nothing that gets to the core of the First People's culture and actually learning about the essence of it, the spirit of it, the real true meaning of these cultures. We never get into any of that, and we certainly don't learn any songs. We give a lot of good grants and stuff to Indigenous artists. Certainly, a lot of good funding actually for that. There's a whole Sirius XM radio station specifically for Indigenous music in Canada.
Nice.
So there's definitely good access to it, but is it taught in schools at all? No. Is it are we really brought into not only like the music but the reasons for the music, any explanation whatsoever as to why some of the spiritual and sacred songs were sung, or we just learn at best, the myth of it. And the myth always just makes it feel, to me, it's like, I don't know, it just feels so like it clearly doesn't mean anything when we're defining it by some, it's like it's a myth and it's a story about this thing and this bird comes down or whatever, something so kind of, it's like, okay, sure, but like that these things always go deeper, right? The meaning of
Yeah,
these
it's
these
detached
songs are
from
far,
the,
far
from the music.
from the spirit of it too, right? And like the
Yeah.
true essence of these things. So, we still have a long, I would say, and I'm sure, like, well, I won't speak on behalf of anybody of First Peoples, and descendants, but I can imagine that they would agree that there's a lot more to go. And I think the big part is like you said, Bill, like, why I wish in school, like, I wanted to learn these songs and like these rhythms too, a lot of the fantastic drumming that
Oh my
comes,
gosh, it's incredible,
such
isn't it?
good drumming. Oh my God, drum circles. I mean, just, oh my God, what a
Over the
transcendent
top.
experience, right? And to really get into like, why is that so incredible, right? And the way they make the drums is a whole sacred, process as well. And why is that so sacred? Like, why? Like, why can't we get into
Yeah.
those nitty gritty details? Because I think that's where we would get a lot better. We would get a much better understanding for these people, for one, and that would allow such a better bridge of connection because I think they have a solid understanding of us. They do. I mean, we've forced our culture on them, and
Yeah.
they have a very good idea of who we are. We have a very limited idea of who they are and where they come from. And I think if we can, through music, I think that's a great suggestion. Like, why not learn these songs? And then the best part about all that is when you can morph them together and have a hybrid. Where you take their culture and then you merge your culture, and then you get to create some new music basically through that, which is my favorite part
Oh
of all
yeah.
that. Is like, I love playing with my friends who are playing, um, like some Tamil or Sanskrit, ancient, Indian music, for example, and I'll play some modern synth, something else over top of it. It sounds awesome. It's like,
Yeah.
that's so much fun,
That's like we're
you
doing
know?
like with Ananda Mayo, it's Tibetan bowls and keyboard and like being able to blend that ancient and I don't want to call it modern, but yeah, the
Oh, I
sensibilities.
mean, it's just you playing your style of piano over top of that is just it's absolutely
It's
mind bending. I could
yeah,
sit
like
and listen
heart
to
bending.
that
It
for
gets
hours.
in your soul in a way that,
Yeah.
and that's why I'm so excited about that doing the West Indian praise band, because it was an opportunity to bring a genre like praise music into connection with a new kind of inflection, a new musical inflection that's actually really old and really ancient. Being able to transform that somehow. So yeah, let's do this. I I don't know that there's anybody in government who's going to listen to any of these kinds of ideas, but here we are being advocates for something that hasn't been tried yet, as far as we know. Why not take the initiative? And here in San Diego, we have lots of Native American tribes that surround us in Southern California. And on top of that layer, then there's also the ancient Mexican layer, which isn't quite so ancient, but it's there. So there's that culture and cultural influence. And as a white guy, I feel like very much like a colonizer here. Although in California, anyway, at least our part of it, it's switching the other way around. It's like the Mexican, Central America, South America is starting to colonize Southern California, which is changing the culture, right? And part of that, of
Yeah.
course, is why Disney came out with that incredible movie, the Day of the Dead movie. What was it called?
Oh, I didn't see that.
It's a wonderful musically, it's wonderful, and it's about the actual Mexican celebration of the Day of the Dead, the way it ought to be done, right, and the memory of the ancestors and all of that. And the music is
Mm.
incredible, and it's very intentional in terms of like crossing the cultures and blending them together, seen through the eyes of a child, who's learning about his heritage for the first time.
Mm.
And that kind of thing is remarkable to me because it's done through music so well. And we're not Disney, but we can advocate for this. I mean, I have in my family, my grandson is a quarter native,
Okay.
and so this is close in, and not being able to help care for the culture that is part of my grandson is important to me. I feel like I'm missing something, like where are the pieces? Some Somebody from one of the local bands help me understand, teach me the music that is part of my grandson's heritage, and because I want to know. But that's just me. And wouldn't it be amazing if like you said, in school. So I don't know where we're going with this. It's obviously it's a different kind of consciousness than we often hear in the world of politics when it comes to the government's care for well, the sad truth of the reservations that were made in the United States uh, for what we called Indians at the time
Hmm.
just wasn't a skillful solution. And hey, go native tribes, because who owns the gambling business in the United States right now? Right? So if
Right.
we can do any, it's getting there, but this is a different level of consciousness. You and I are bringing to this already, and man, if there's a way to do this musically, to be able to create the bridges where there's currently a disconnect, how would that change? How could that change things?
Yeah, I think really just merging all of them together and creating music together with like just someone from each culture and just having a beautiful mergence of all of them and learning about each of them and
Yeah,
then seeing how they can all coalesce together and work together to create something even more beautiful, because that's the coolest thing is that music can also teach you, it teaches you that diversity is a asset. It's always a good thing.
yeah,
You need to change things up creatively, add in some diversity. And I mean diversity in any, like, weird instruments you've never played from other cultures, weird scales or chord progressions you've never played from other cultures.
yep.
Of course, any other musician from any other culture would add in a flavor you would never expect and never be able to write on your own. It's an absolute bulletproof solution for creative blocks, I'll tell you that, you
Definitely,
know?
especially for musicians,
Absolutely.
you know, because we don't have to talk about it or write it down, like in language. We can all read the same sort of chord charts or rhythm charts or whatever the basic thing is, or even just sit down and somebody starts a beat and everybody else just picks up and jams with it. And
Oh, that's my favorite.
yeah, and that's so completely organic. And I'm hoping that we're going to get at least audio, maybe video of your trip to Mexico, where you get to do music inside of these ancient structures with modern people and see how see the response, right? Because
Oh
even
yeah.
though like the ancient people aren't there, their edifice, their container is there for us to go and play around in, and hopefully to pick up on their energy, that's still left in that space and their intention of creating that space. I'm just fascinated by this stuff. I mean, as you can probably,
Oh, me
I'll
too.
shut up for
Me
about.
Ah, I mean, we could talk about it for a long time, but I mean, I think one last thought for me is, and this is just a really fun way that I love to explore new places is through music, right? And we can do this through food, of course. Great way to experience cultures through food as well. Food and music, I'd say, maybe my top two.
There we go.
And one of the best is like you go to a new place and just I look up and I want to find like local musicians and try to find like the ones. I honestly, any good music's good music, but try to find the local traditional types of music and try to see that. So when I remember being in Portugal, I'd look at fado guitar, which is an old, Portuguese folk guitar type of music, and quite different than the flamenco guitar of Spain, which I would go see as well, and just fell in love with that
Which
genre.
is what, a couple
And
hundred miles away, and there's these two
not even
distinct.
that, and they're so different.
Yeah,
And then I could hear in the music of certain flamenco guitar this Middle Eastern influence on some of the scales and some of the notes. I was like, oh my God. And then, of course, you hear through their history. Of course, there's all this migration and mix of cultures too there. So you can get a history lesson just through music. I mean, it's just music it's just an amazing way to experience culture. And I think that's a great way for us to be able to become more tolerant and respectful towards all and others is just get into each other's music.
seriously. Although
What
I
a
have to
fun way to
draw the
do
line at some genres where I'm not quite there yet. Me personally, not
it.
everybody, but just me, right? There are some things, like it took me a while to get into hip hop and rap, and it took me a while to get into ska. Um,
Oh,
there are
ska, yeah.
aspects of
Yeah.
metal that I'm still like not completely down with, but in terms of complexity, metal really lights me up intellectually because of the polyrhythms and it's incredible.
Yeah, I
But
think I half watch it for my brain or listen
yeah,
to it for my
right.
brain.
But it's a acquired taste, and some of the especially when the culture's so different from yours, the taste of a culture that is brand new, that is completely unusual, that you've never heard before, they're really off-putting. I got to hear well, I'm going to call it Persian. So I got to hear some Persian music, authentic, the kind of music that would have been played for Sufi dancers thousands of years ago. And some of the instruments that are used are very difficult for a Western ear to hear.
Mm.
And I was in a college environment, so this was, it was like it was a nailed up presentation with virtuoso musicians. Like, it was incredible. And there was a neuroscience part of it too. So this guy was explaining the
Oh,
neuroscience of the
wow.
instruments, and it was phenomenal, but hard to listen until you learn to, right? And it's easier, I think, for musicians like you and me. We would learn to listen quicker than someone who's just like listening to pop all the time or whatever. And that's not a judgment
Yeah.
call. It's just like, you train your brain, right? So as you become more immersed, it starts to speak to you like internally rather than just being sounds that you hear with your ears.
Mm.
And that's the moment when it comes alive. And all of a sudden you realize that, oh my God, I can track 7, 5, 12, 11. If it changes every measure, I can track it for some reason. How did I do that? But it doesn't matter because you're in it, you know, and all of a sudden the dance makes sense or whatever it is. And that's a beautiful moment. I just wish that for everybody. If you have a chance to grok a moment like that, go search for it. Like Chris, like you're saying, if you go into town and it's new, go out into town square and start listening. And if you hear some music, go that way.
Yeah. Follow the music.
And who knows where that could lead you. Take some courage, right? Drop me in the middle of somewhere, and
it's an adventure. If it's terrible, that's great too. It's all part of the story.
It's all part of the story. The story that we're all telling, right?
Story of life.
The story of life. Thank you for listening in on our conversation and for taking time to show your appreciation with a like, share, or subscribe. Discussions of Music, Healing, and Consciousness is a practice of spontaneity, and we welcome your comments, ideas, and questions. There are ways to connect with us in the show notes, so let us hear from you. Until next time, this is Bill Peratzman along with Chris Noble wishing you great musical health. Samara Huchaya.